I'm Mike Scipione here at the Addison Historical Museum, and joining me is Rebecca Tulloch, who you might recognize from just a few weeks ago for her portrayal as one of the Rockford Peaches. Today she's embodying the spirit of Louisa May Alcott. It's so great to have you with us again. Welcome back. Thanks. I think when people hear the name Louisa May Alcott, they immediately think Little Women. And I'd like you to bring us back, if you could, bring us back to that time before the release of that iconic novel, before she became the kind of the household name in the literary circles.
Well, before she became famous for writing Little Women in 1867, she was part of just a regular family. Not a very, I wouldn't say they lived in poverty, but they never really had a lot of money and relied a lot on charity. Of course, she had three sisters, like depicted in the movie and the books, Little Women. However, the characters in the books were kind of like what she imagined her family would like to be. And although some of the things that she did or wrote about in the book did happen in her life, but they were definitely a more dreamy or fanciful way of thinking how she would have liked life to be. For example, in her book, she talks about cutting her hair off, or Jo, the character that embodies her, cuts her hair off to raise money so she could send Marmee to Boston on the train. And in real life, she didn't do that. However, in real life, when she got sick after being a nurse in the Union Hotel Hospital, when she was brought back home to Concord, one of the treatments for typhoid fever, in order to bring the fever down, is they cut all your hair off. So she would lose her hair in real life to the war of sorts, but it was to sort of save her own life, to keep the fever down. So when she was writing Little Women, she sort of took that idea and romanticized it, said, oh, well, she gave up, her hair for the war, but Jo will make a sacrifice of her hair to make some money to send Marmee to Boston. So that's what I mean by some things from real life, but she romanticized them and made them wishful of what she wished her life had been.
Yeah. And she started writing because of some financial difficulty and some hardships that they faced throughout.
So growing up, her family never really had a lot of money. They moved around a lot. They moved some 29, 30 times in her lifetime. They moved many times when she was a child. She had been born in Germantown, Pennsylvania, but lived most of her life in Massachusetts. She lived in Boston. She lived in Concord on and off several times. Her father, Bronson Alcott, was sort of an eccentric person. He had interesting ideas about teaching. He was a teacher. He liked to write, although he wasn't the most interesting writer to read. But he also believed in trying to, he believed that he was sort of a vegetarian, you might say. He helped develop the Transcendentalist movement with Waldo Emerson and David Thoreau. And he one time he would go live on these like experimental communes of sort. So a couple of times he took his family, one place particularly called Fruitlands, where they moved to this place in the summer, and they didn't really plant. He wasn't a farmer, so he didn't really know what crops to plant. He didn't know how to really plant. So by the time the fall came around, the winter, they were starving because they didn't have any food, and so they had to leave the commune. And so that was a silly idea. So they were always struggling as she was growing up in various ways.
And you mentioned Thoreau and Emerson and I think even what is it, Nathaniel Hawthorne, right? Yeah. So she had a lot of personal influences with a lot of these luminaries that influenced her writing.
So David Thoreau was actually one of her teachers when she was a little girl. She would learn from him. Emerson was a teacher and supporter of the family. In fact, he used to give money to the family to help support them buying a home or living expenses. And of course, he made his library available to her as well. So yeah, he was a great supporter of the family. So she had this very eclectic of education of sorts between what she was learning from her father and the luminaries, the literary luminaries that were around her.
And aside from her writing, what other activities or interests did she pursue?
So one of the things in the book that was sort of accurate is that she was very much into drama and theatrics. In fact, as a little girl, she often thought that when she grew up that she would take to the stage. So that idea was definitely characterized in Jo in the book Little Women.
And I know that part of her life was faced with a lot of health challenges. Now, she kind of was going through a lot of this stuff while she was writing, correct?
So in the early part of her life, all the way up until she went to become a nurse with the Union Hospital in Washington, she was very healthy. She never had any health concerns of particular note besides a regular cold or anything like that. But when she returned early from being a nurse in 1863, she was brought home because she had typhoid fever, and she nearly died at the Union Hotel Hospital. And they basically sent her home from the Union Hotel Hospital expecting her to die and wanting her to die at home. She was able to beat the odds, so to speak, but the rest of her life she would suffer with various illnesses. Some they think might have been from the mercury that they treated typhoid fever with. Others have, I was reading a book recently that they think maybe she just had very bad depression, but they're unsure. There might have been more going on than just mercury poisoning or the effects from typhoid.
And she also engaged a lot in the community, right? She was kind of an activist. She had a lot of luminaries around her.
Right, so her family was. So her family being transcendentalists, in fact, that part of Massachusetts, in fact, most of Boston, they were abolitionists. And so at one point, before the Civil War, her family actually housed a fugitive slave for a couple nights, so which was very dangerous, particularly in the 1850s because of the fugitive slave law. If you were caught by officials, even in a state like Massachusetts, which was a free state, you could be arrested for breaking the law. Because according to the fugitive slave law, you were supposed to return any property back to the South.
Now I see you got a lot of items here today. Now it looks like these are maybe bandages. How would she was like she's a nurse. So yeah.
Louisa May Alcott, she always felt like she wanted to do something for the war because they were abolitionists. Now she knew she couldn't go fight as a soldier. She wished that she could, so she thought, well, if she couldn't be a soldier, she could nurse the soldiers that were fighting. And so she applied to be a nurse, and there was a new organization called the U.S. Nursing Corps being led by Dorothea Dix. But Dorothea Dix, sometimes they refer to her as the Dragon Lady, had very strict rules, and one of the rules, you had to be 30 years of age, you had to be single, and you had to be plain looking. And Louisa felt that she fit the bill. The only thing that she was lacking was she wasn't quite 30 yet when she wanted to join. So in November of 1862, when she turned 30, she then applied and she was accepted. So she was sent down to Washington City, which is what they called Washington, D.C. at the time, and she was assigned to the Union Hotel Hospital. And the Union Hotel Hospital had been the Union Hotel before it was taken by the Army and turned into a hospital. So back when Louisa May Alcott got there, the ward that she was assigned to had been the ballroom in the hotel. So she would spend the next 45 days there. And there was quite a horrible battle that occurred while Louisa May Alcott was at this hospital. It's the Battle of Fredericksburg, which was only about 70 miles from Washington. So Battle of Fredericksburg was a horrible defeat for the Union, and there were thousands of soldiers that were sent up to Washington. So she said when she saw the wagons coming in the days following after that battle, it looked like wagons coming to market. And it wasn't until they got up close to the hospital that she could see there was filled with dying and wounded men. And so they brought them into the hospital, and they had them everywhere they could put a wounded soldier, they would put them. And one of her jobs in the hospital was washing and caring for the soldiers. She had no nursing training per se, other than reading Florence Nightingale's books, Notes on Nursing. So she believed that cleanliness, it was next to godliness, and felt that clean water and good food and fresh air were all important things to good healing. So part of her role was, when the soldiers came in, was to remove any bad bandages. Now, a lot of these soldiers might have had amputations already, so it was her job to take those bandages off and evaluate the wound. And a lot of those wounds might have become gangrenous again after a couple days in a wagon being transported. So if that were the case, she would identify it, and then the surgeons would have to then remove another piece of the limb. So it was not uncommon for soldiers to have amputations, not just once, not just twice, but sometimes 3 times. And each time they got the amputations closer to the core of the body, you had less chance of surviving. So if you had a finger amputating, you had a pretty 80-90% chance you were going to live. But if you got shot at the upper part of your leg and they had to take your leg at the upper part of the thigh, you were probably going to die. And that was another role that Louisa had to fill, is she would often sit with the soldiers, particularly the ones that were dying, and help them write that very difficult letter back home to their family, telling their family what happened. And sometimes if the person died before she had a chance to finish, she would finish that letter on her own and mail it to them. So she said that was one of the hardest things that she had to do when she was a nurse. Just a fun story, though, is I'm wearing a little bottle around my neck, and she would fill a bottle like this with perfume, lavender water. And because the stench in these hospital wards were atrocious, if you can imagine, these soldiers weren't hobbling out to the outhouse behind the building. So there's bedpans and buckets, and of course it's December, and so it's cold outside, so the windows weren't open, so you could imagine the stench in there. So in fact, she would go around each morning and open the windows and try and air it out. But of course all the soldiers complained and telling, "Oh, are you trying to kill us?" Because they believed that outside air carried disease. And in the summer, if you kept your windows open, somehow you would get things like malaria, which actually means bad air. Malaria is bad air. So even in the summer, they wanted to keep the windows closed. So she couldn't do that. So she said, well, how could she, make it smell better? So she had brought from home a big bottle of lavender water. So she brought that lavender water, and she would walk around the hospital ward, and she would drop droplets of lavender water on the pillows of the different soldiers to try to make them smell better. And of course, all the soldiers would be watching her drop this bottle of little drops of lavender water on the pillows, and they would be laughing at her and thinking, what's that going to do? It's not going to make it smell any better. But Louisa May Alcott, she knew better, and she just sat back and said, I'm in a room filled with men who are dying and afraid they may not live till tomorrow, and I just got them to laugh.
About that, yeah. Now, did she ever use the lavender for treatment at all, or was it just for?
It was just for smell and to kind of humor and take the soldiers' thoughts off dying and the pain they're in. Yeah. She also read a lot to them. She would read the classics. She read Shakespeare to them. She read stories to them. Anything to help entertain them, to take their minds off the horror that they were living through.
And she kind of had like a couple of different voices in her writing. So maybe that was like the first voice that she kind of experienced through that lens of the Civil War.
So before she was a nurse at the Union Hospital, in the 1850s, she was always a struggling writer, and she would write primarily stories to make money, sell in magazines and journals and things like that. And it was to hopefully, keep her family afloat. So she wrote sensational, like Pulp Fiction type stories that were adventures and things that she never really lived herself. So when she was a nurse at the Union Hotel Hospital, she would write letters home all the time, and that was definitely a different writing style, because she's writing about herself to her family. And after about 45 days at the hospital, she contracted typhoid fever, which was very common because you're walking around all this sickness all day long. In fact, the superintendent of the hospital, Hannah Rope, she died of it a few days earlier. So Louisa didn't want to leave. She was trying to get better, but finally the doctors, who were all concerned about it, said she's not going to probably survive. So they had her father bring her home. So she went back to Concord, Massachusetts. Well, about a year later, after she did recover, her father and her said, well, let's put some of these articles together and maybe we could, make some money with it or just share the story. So that's what happened. It was printed in a journal in 4 segments, and the segments were wildly popular. People wanted to know what was going to happen next, and her style of writing was very different. And so her publisher, Thomas Niles, said, let's make a book. So her first book became a storybook, a book called Hospital Sketches, and I have a copy of it right here. So that's the book. It's not a very big read, but it's kind of, again, it's not exactly like a blow-by-blow documentary, but it contains most of the stuff, most of the different things that happened to her in the hospital, but they were organized into a day, a night, arrival, and after. So it's a very nice read. Yeah. And so So that became her first book she actually made some money with, was Hospital Sketches.
Yeah. And speaking of, I can't help but notice the bullet that you have over here.
So, yeah, we forgot to talk about the bullet. So here's the bullet. This is a 58 caliber musket ball. They were made of lead. And the reason this ball was so devastating is it was a very slow muzzle velocity, which meant that when it hit bone, it just didn't break the bone and keep going. It hit the bone and shattered. So fragments of this would go all through the leg, shattering, really devastating a limb.
Yeah.
So if you were hit by one of these in the arm, the surgeons, first of all, they didn't have time, unless you were a general, for them to try to put the pieces back together. So the quickest way to save your life, and that was the idea, they were trying to save your life, was to amputate. Now, it's not like in a movie. Actually took 2 surgeons to agree that you had to have an amputation. So it wasn't one surgeon on their own. So if a surgeon thought their amputation, they'd have to get a concurrence from another surgeon to agree that an amputation had to take place. But again, it was to save your life. Okay, if they didn't do that, you would be probably dead from gangrene.
And this is like that mortar pestle that she would probably grind up some stuff.
Right.
With.
So she wasn't an expert on medicines, but she would often be directed to make certain things, different medicines.
Okay. And then the candle here is.
So that was just their lighting. So if she was reading to a soldier, she'd be using a candle like this. Okay. In fact, when she first started working at the hospital, she was on the day shift. She worked 12 hours a day, 7 in the morning to 7 at night. But then she actually chose to switch to the night shift. The reason she did that is because she wanted to be able to go around Washington in the morning and explore. Right. So her whole life, she pretty much lived in and around Boston and Concord and Massachusetts, never been to Washington. So she wanted to actually explore. So she would spend some of her day seeing troops marching around drilling. At this time, the dome of the U.S. Capitol was still being built. In fact, that was one of the few projects that Abraham Lincoln insisted continue. Although much of the money was going to support the war, he said the Capitol must continue because it was a symbol, he felt, that of our country. So the Capitol had to continue.
Yeah. And then I read that she, one of the family homes actually is now a museum in Concord, Massachusetts.
Right, so she lived in a few homes in Concord. Orchard House, which is the house where she actually wrote the story of Little Women, is a museum now and you could visit. But the house where she lived, that Little Women is actually based on, is Hillside, which is the house directly next door to where Orchard House was. But when they moved back to Concord, that house was not available. So the Orchard House, which was a little bit more run down and required a lot of work to be fixed up, was the house that they moved into when they moved back to Orchard House.
Thank you so much again for joining us, Rebecca. This has been great. For sure. Thank you again. It's been wonderful.